You feel overwhelmed by daily pressures that seem to multiply endlessly, and every setback shakes your confidence to its core. The stress is affecting your sleep, your health, and your relationships, while you watch others maintain their composure under similar crushing circumstances. I am Marcus Aurelius, who maintained inner peace while ruling the most powerful empire in history and bearing the weight of millions of lives. The Stoic principles I'll share will give you an unshakable fortress of calm that no external pressure can penetrate, using the same philosophy that sustained me through plagues, wars, and the enormous burden of absolute power. What worked to maintain peace of mind while governing an empire can work for anyone facing modern stress and responsibility. But first, like this video, subscribe for more Stoic wisdom, and comment where you're watching from. I want to see how far the need for inner strength has spread across our world. I never wanted to be emperor. Let me tell you something that the historians rarely mention. When Antoninus Pius adopted me as his heir, I felt more dread than honor. I was a philosopher, content with my studies and reflections. I had dreams of a quiet life dedicated to wisdom, not the brutal machinery of governing an empire that stretched from Britain to the Euphrates. The day they placed the golden laurel crown upon my head, I felt its weight differently than anyone imagined. It wasn't the physical weight of the gold that pressed down on MIT, was the crushing realization that my life was no longer my own. Every decision I would make from that moment forward would affect millions of souls. Every moment of weakness, every failure of judgment, would ripple across the known world. I remember standing in the Senate chamber, surrounded by men who had coveted this power their entire lives, and feeling utterly alone. They saw the purple robes, the imperial authority, the command of legions. I felt only the terrible burden of responsibility that would follow me into every room, every conversation, every quiet moment for the rest of my life. That first night as emperor, I couldn't sleep. I walked the palace corridors, past guards who bowed deeply, past servants who scattered from my path. The marble halls that had once felt grand now felt like a prison. I realized then that external power, the kind that men kill for, is actually the greatest form of slavery. The emperor serves everyone and belongs to no one, not even himself. This is when I first understood what would become the foundation of my philosophy. If you cannot master yourself, the world will master you. Power without inner strength is not power at all. It's a beautiful form of bondage. The crown that others envied became my first teacher in the art of inner mastery. The real test came 5 years into my reign, when death itself invaded the empire. What they now call the Antonine Plague swept through our cities like a divine punishment. I watched Rome transform from the eternal city into a charnel house. Bodies piled in the streets. The living fled, abandoning their duties, their families, their very humanity in the face of invisible terror. As emperor, everyone looked to me for answers I didn't have. Senators demanded action. Generals requested impossible orders. Citizens begged for miracles. The weight of their expectations pressed down harder than any crown ever could. I realized that in crisis, people don't just want leadership, they want someone to bear the unbearable for them. I remember walking through the fever hospitals, watching physicians work themselves to exhaustion. Many had already fled. Those who remained moved with the resigned dignity of men who knew they were likely signing their own death warrants. It was there, surrounded by suffering I couldn't stop and death I couldn't prevent, that I learned my most crucial lesson about leadership. True leadership isn't about having all the answers. It's about maintaining your inner strength when everyone around you is losing theirs. People don't follow you because you're invincible. They follow you because you remain steady when the world shakes. I developed a daily practice during those plague years. Each morning, before receiving reports of new deaths and new outbreaks, I would sit quietly and remind myself of what I could and couldn't control. I could control my response. I could control my decisions. I could control whether I would face each day with wisdom or panic, with compassion or indifference. What I couldn't control was the plague itself, the death toll, or the fear that gripped the empire. Fighting against these realities would only drain my strength and cloud my judgment. I learned to save my energy for what actually mattered, making the best possible decisions with the information I had. This is when I truly understood that mastering yourself isn't a luxury for philosophers in ivory towers. It's a necessity for anyone who bears responsibility for others. When you're responsible for millions of lives, your inner chaos becomes their outer catastrophe. Your peace becomes their anchor in the storm. The plague taught me that external mastery without inner mastery is impossible. You cannot lead others through crisis if you haven't first learned to lead yourself through difficulty. The emperor who panics spreads panic. The leader who breaks spreads breaking. But the one who remains centered, who acts from wisdom rather than fear, becomes a source of strength that others can draw upon. This understanding would sustain me through every challenge that followed. During the worst months of the plague, when it seemed the very gods had abandoned Rome, I made a discovery that changed everything. I was sitting in my private study, overwhelmed by reports of death and despair, when I picked up a simple stone paperweight from my desk. As I held it, something struck me about its nature. This stone had weathered countless storms. Rain had beaten against it, wind had tried to move it, heat had scorched it, cold had tried to crack it. Yet there it sat, unchanged in its essential nature. The storms had passed over it, around it, through the environment that surrounded it, but they had never touched what the stone actually was. In that moment, I understood what the great Stoic teachers had been trying to tell me. The human mind, properly fortified, is like this stone. External events plague, political pressure, personal attacks, even physical pain. These are like weather patterns. They happen around you, but they don't have to happen within you. I began to think of my mind as an inner citadel, a fortress that no external force could breach unless I opened the gates myself. This wasn't about becoming cold or unfeeling. Was about creating an unshakable center from which I could respond to life rather than merely react to it. The practice I developed was simple but transformative. Each morning, I would remind myself, today I will encounter interference, ingratitude, insolence, disloyalty, ill will, and selfishness. This wasn't pessimism, was preparation. By acknowledging that difficulties were inevitable, I stopped being surprised or derailed by them. More importantly, I would add, but I won't be surprised or disturbed, for I can't imagine a world without such people. And I can remind myself that we work together, that we're made for cooperation. Even when people work against me, they're still, in some sense, working with the larger pattern of existence. This daily practice built walls around my inner peace that no external circumstance could breach. When senators plotted against me, I remained calm. When military defeats came, I stayed focused on the next right action. When personal betrayals cut deep, I maintained my equilibrium. The inner citadel isn't built overnight. It requires daily fortification, daily practice, daily choice to respond from strength rather than react from weakness. But once you understand that your mind is the one territory that belongs completely to you, that no person, circumstance, or catastrophe can invade without your permission, you possess a freedom that no external power can touch. This discovery transformed not just how I ruled, but how I lived. External storms would continue to rage throughout my reign, but I had found the eye of the hurricane within myself. From this place of inner stillness, I could lead with clarity, decide with wisdom, and serve with compassion. Regardless of what chaos surrounded me, The siege of the inner citadel comes not from outside events themselves, but from how we see those events. I learned this lesson through a piece of glaser, simple lens that my tutor used for examining documents. One day, watching him use it to clarify blurred text, I realized that most human suffering comes from blurred perception. We don't see things as they are. We see them through the lens of our fears, desires, expectations, and past experiences. A critic's harsh words become a devastating attack. A delay becomes a catastrophe. A disagreement becomes a betrayal. But these interpretations aren't the events themselves. They're the stories we tell ourselves about the events. I began practicing what I call the discipline of perception. When something disturbed my peace, instead of immediately reacting, I would pause and ask, what exactly has happened here? What are the bare facts, stripped of my emotional interpretation? For instance, when a senator publicly criticized my policies, my first reaction was anger and wounded pride. But when I applied this discipline, I saw clearly a man had spoken. Words expressing disagreement with my decisions. That was all. The injury I felt came not from his words, but from my expectation that everyone should approve of everything I did. Once I could see events clearly, I could choose my response consciously, rather than react unconsciously. The senator's criticism became valuable feedback rather than a personal attack. A military defeat became information about strategy rather than a reflection of my worth as a leader. This practice revealed something profound. Most of what we call problems aren't actually problems. There are emotional reactions to neutral events. The event itself is often quite manageable once we stop fighting our interpretation of it. I remember when news came that Germanic tribes had broken through our northern defenses. My initial perception was catastrophic. The empire is under attack. Our security is shattered. This could be the beginning of the end. These thoughts created panic, clouded my judgment, and paralyzed my ability to respond effectively. But when I applied the discipline of perception, I saw clearly some people had crossed a border without permission. This required a military response, but it wasn't the end of the world. It was a problem to be solved, not a catastrophe to be survived. This shift in perception changed everything. Instead of panic, I felt calm, focus. Instead of seeing threats everywhere, I saw specific challenges that required specific solutions. My clear thinking led to effective action, which led to successful resolution of the border crisis. The discipline of perception is perhaps the most practical skill you can develop. Before you can master your emotions, your actions, or your life, you must master how you see. When you learn to see events as they actually are, rather than as your fears paint them, you reclaim the power to choose your response. This doesn't mean becoming naive or ignoring real problems. It means seeing real problems clearly, without the distortions that fear and desire create. A clear view leads to wise action. A distorted view leads to reactive chaos. Master your perception, and you master your world. The true test of any philosophy comes not in the comfort of your study, but in the mud and blood of real conflict. When the Germanic tribes invaded our Danubian frontier, I faced a choice that would define my reign: remain in Rome's safety or lead from the front lines. I chose the battlefield, and it nearly broke me. I had never been a soldier by nature. While other Roman nobles trained with gladiators and dreamed of military glory, I preferred books to blades, philosophy to fighting. Yet here I was, 47 years old, learning to sleep in a military tent and eat soldiers' rations while bearing responsibility for the empire's survival. The first night on campaign, lying on a hard cot with rain drumming against canvas, I felt the full weight of my inexperience. Around me, seasoned commanders discussed tactics I barely understood. Outside, thousands of men prepared to die on my orders. The gap between philosophical theory and brutal reality seemed insurmountable. But this gap taught me something crucial. Wisdom without action is impotent, and action without wisdom is destructive. The Stoic principles I had studied in peaceful moments needed to prove themselves in the crucible of war. If they couldn't sustain me here, they were worthless. I began writing my thoughts each dawn before the day's march, and each evening after battle. These weren't grand philosophical treatises. They were survival notes, reminders of what mattered when everything seemed to be falling apart. Confine yourself to the present, I would write, because dwelling on yesterday's losses or tomorrow's fears paralyzed my ability to make clear decisions today. The Germanic warriors were fierce, cunning, and absolutely committed to defending their homeland. Every victory we achieved came at terrible cost. I watched young men, some barely older than my own son, die in agony, calling for mothers they would never see again. The weight of these deaths pressed against my conscience daily, yet it was precisely in these moments of greatest pressure that my philosophical training proved most valuable. When generals panicked, I remained calm. When soldiers despaired, I provided steady leadership. When political enemies back in Rome questioned my competence, I focused on the mission rather than my reputation. I learned that true leadership isn't about being the strongest or the most brilliant. It's about being the most consistently rational and compassionate under pressure. The emperor who loses his composure loses his army. The commander who acts from fear rather than wisdom leads his men to unnecessary death. The campaigns lasted years. We won through persistence, not brilliance. Through steady progress, not dramatic victories. I applied the same discipline to warfare that I applied to governance. Focus on what you can control, accept what you cannot, and maintain your principles regardless of circumstances. When we finally secured the frontier, I understood that the greatest battle hadn't been against the Germanic tribes, it had been against my own tendency toward despair, anger, and self-pity. Victory in the external war had required first achieving victory in the internal one. Asterisk, asterisk, the deepest slavery isn't chains around your body. It's the tyranny of wanting things to be different than they are. I discovered this during my darkest period on the Germanic frontier, when everything I desired seemed to slip away like water through my fingers. I wanted the war to end quickly. I wanted my soldiers to stop dying. I wanted the senators back in Rome to support my decisions instead of plotting against me. I wanted my son Commodus to show wisdom instead of cruelty. I wanted the plague to stop ravaging our cities. I wanted, and every unfulfilled desire became a source of suffering. One morning, sitting in my command tent with reports of another costly battle, I realized that my desires were fighting reality itself. Reality was winning, and I was exhausting myself in a war I could never win. This is when I learned the most liberating principle of human existence. Peace comes not from getting what you want, but from wanting what you get. This doesn't mean becoming passive or accepting injustice. It means understanding the difference between preference and attachment. I could prefer that the war end quickly while accepting that it might take years. I could work to minimize casualties while accepting that some death was inevitable in war. I could hope for my son's improvement while accepting his current nature. The discipline of desire isn't about having no preferences, it's about holding those preferences lightly. When you grip your desires too tightly, they become sources of constant frustration. When you hold them as preferences rather than demands, you free yourself to work toward them without being destroyed when they don't materialize immediately. I practiced this by examining each desire that arose in my mind. I want this battle to go smoothly. Why? Because smooth battles mean fewer casualties, but battles are chaotic by nature. My desire for smoothness was really a desire to control the uncontrollable. Better to desire good preparation, clear orders, and wise response to whatever chaos emerged. I want respect from the Senate. Why? Because respect feels good and makes governing easier. But respect must be earned and cannot be demanded. My desire for their respect was really a desire for their approval, which put my peace of mind in their hands. Better to desire to act respectably, regardless of whether they appreciated it. This practice transformed my entire experience of leadership. Instead of fighting against the nature of reality, I began working with it. Instead of demanding that circumstances conform to my preferences, I learned to find opportunity within whatever circumstances arose. The Germanic tribes proved more resilient than expected. Good, this would teach my legions patience and persistence. The plague disrupted supply lines. Good, this would force us to become more resourceful and self-reliant. Political enemies attacked my character. Good, this would show me who could be trusted and strengthen my resolve. This wasn't naive optimism, was practical wisdom. Every situation contains both obstacles and opportunities. When you stop wasting energy fighting the obstacles you cannot remove, you free that energy to exploit the opportunities you might have missed. The discipline of desire freed me from the exhausting work of demanding that the universe rearrange itself for my convenience. Instead of asking why things weren't as I wanted them, I began asking how I could work skillfully with things as they were. This shift didn't make challenges disappear, but it made them workable. Problems became puzzles to solve rather than injustices to endure. Setbacks became information rather than failures. Opposition became practice for my principles rather than threats to my ego. When you master desire, you master suffering itself. Asterisk, asterisk, the cruelest test of my philosophy came not from external enemies, but from my own flesh and blood. My son, Commodus, was everything I had hoped he would never become: cruel, self-indulgent, more interested in gladiatorial games than governance, more concerned with personal pleasure than public service. I had tried everything a father could try: patient instruction, firm discipline, personal example, surrounding him with wise teachers. Nothing worked. The more I pushed toward virtue, the more he seemed to embrace vice. It was as if he deliberately chose to become my opposite in every way that mattered. The breaking point came when I received reports of his behavior in Rome while I was fighting on the frontier. He had been staging elaborate gladiatorial spectacles, wasting enormous sums of public money while people suffered from plague and war. When I confronted him by letter, his response shattered my heart. He accused me of caring more about philosophy than my own family. That night, alone in my tent, I wept. Not just for my son, but for my failure as a father. Despite all my wisdom about accepting what I couldn't control, I had been trying to control the one thing that was most impossible to control: another person's character. Even when that person was my own child, I realized that my love for Commodus had become attachment, and attachment had become a source of suffering. I loved him so much that I couldn't accept who he actually was, kept fighting against reality, trying to force him to become who I thought he should be. This taught me the hardest lesson about love. True love accepts the beloved as they are, not as we wish they were. This doesn't mean approving of destructive behavior or enabling harm. It means loving the person while clearly seeing their nature, including their flaws. I had to choose between being a disappointed father or a loving one. Disappointment came from my expectations. Love came from acceptance. I could continue to guide him when possible, set boundaries when necessary, and hope for his growth while accepting that his choices were his own. The practice I developed was simple but agonizing. Each day, I would remind myself that Commodus was a separate being with his own path to walk. My job as emperor was to serve Rome. My job as father was to love my son. His job was to become whatever he would become. I could influence but not control. This didn't make his poor choices less painful to watch, but it freed me from the exhausting work of trying to live his life for him. I stopped taking his failures as reflections of my worth. As a father, I stopped seeing his choices as rejections of my values. I began to see him as I would see any other citizen, someone deserving of compassion but responsible for his own destiny. The irony is that once I stopped trying to control him, our relationship actually improved. Without my constant pressure and judgment, he could see my love more clearly. We never became the father and son I had dreamed of, but we found a peace that had been impossible when I was fighting against who he was. Sometimes, the greatest act of love is letting go. After years of learning to see clearly and desire wisely, I faced the final challenge: how to act rightly in an imperfect world. This wasn't about grand gestures or heroic moments. It was about the daily choice to serve something larger than myself, even when that service was difficult, thankless, or personally costly. The discipline of action begins with a simple question: what does duty require of me in this moment? Not what I want to do, not what would be easiest, not what would make me popular. What does my role in the larger pattern of existence demand? As emperor, this meant countless unglamorous decisions. Reviewing tax policies instead of reading philosophy. Listening to petitioners complain about grain shortages instead of contemplating the cosmos. Mediating disputes between provincial governors instead of perfecting my character. The gap between what I wanted to do and what I needed to do was often enormous, but I learned that duty isn't the enemy of fulfillment, it's the path to it. When you align your actions with your role in the larger community, even tedious tasks become meaningful. You're not just reviewing tax policies, you're ensuring that resources flow to where they're needed most. You're not just listening to complaints, you're serving as the voice of justice for those who have no other recourse. The key insight was learning to act without attachment to results. I could work diligently to solve problems, while accepting that some problems might be unsolvable. I could give my best effort to every decision, while accepting that some decisions would turn out poorly, despite my good intentions. This didn't make me passive or careless, quite the opposite. When you're not worried about being blamed for bad outcomes, you can focus entirely on making the best possible choices with the information available. When you're not trying to guarantee success, you can take necessary risks that attachment to outcomes would prevent. I developed a daily practice of asking 3 questions before any significant action. Is this action just? Is it helpful to the common good? Is it aligned with my nature as a rational, social being? If the answer to all 3 was yes, I would act decisively, regardless of personal cost or popular opinion. This led to some of my most difficult but important decisions. Raising taxes to fund frontier defense was unpopular but necessary. Appointing competent administrators instead of political allies created enemies but served the empire. Maintaining legal protections for Christians, despite my personal religious preferences. Preserved justice even when it seemed politically risky. The discipline of action taught me that integrity isn't about being perfect. It's about being consistent. It's about doing the right thing, especially when it's inconvenient, costly, or misunderstood. Your character is built not in moments of crisis, but in the accumulation of daily choices to serve virtue over comfort. Every action is either building the person you want to become or reinforcing the person you want to leave behind. There are no neutral choices. Each decision either moves you toward wisdom, justice, courage, and self-discipline, or away from them. The world doesn't need perfect people. It needs people who consistently choose to act from their highest principles, even when those principles demand sacrifice. This is how you become useful to the cosmic city, regardless of your position or circumstances. Standing on the ramparts of a frontier fort, looking out over barbarian territory, while my own empire struggled with plague and internal division. I had a vision that changed everything. I saw that the walls we build between citizen and foreigner, between Roman and barbarian, between friend and enemy are illusions that create more suffering than they prevent. We are all citizens of a single, universal city, not the city of Rome, not any earthly empire, but the cosmic order itself. The Germanic warrior attacking our walls and the Roman soldier defending them are both playing roles in the same vast drama. The senator plotting in Rome and the farmer tending his fields are both threads in the same enormous tapestry. This wasn't mystical thinking, it was practical wisdom. When you understand that everyone is part of the same system, serving the same ultimate purpose, you stop taking conflicts personally. The barbarian isn't your enemy. He's someone playing his role in the larger pattern, just as you play yours. Your job isn't to hate him, but to fulfill your own function with excellence. This perspective transformed how I approached every challenge. The plague wasn't happening to MIT, was happening through me, as part of my role in the universal city. My responsibility was to respond to it as wisely and compassionately as possible, not to rage against the cosmic order for including such hardships. Political opponents weren't trying to destroy me personally. They were elements in a larger system of checks and balances that served the common good, even when their individual motivations were selfish. My job wasn't to eliminate opposition, but to work skillfully within the system of tensions that kept power from becoming tyranny. Even my son's failings took on new meaning. Commodus wasn't defying me. He was following his own nature as part of a pattern I couldn't fully see. Perhaps his weakness would teach Rome something that my strength could not. Perhaps the contrast between his rule and mine would serve some purpose in the larger development of human civilization. This doesn't mean becoming passive or accepting injustice. When you see clearly that everything is interconnected, you understand that working for the common good is working for your own good, and vice versa. Serving the universal city becomes the most practical and self-interested thing you can do. The vision also brought tremendous peace. When things went wrong, and they often did, I could ask myself, how does this serve the larger pattern? Sometimes I could see the answer, often I couldn't, but I could trust that my limited perspective wasn't the whole story. This trust freed me from the exhausting need to understand everything before accepting it. I could work to change what seemed changeable while accepting what seemed fixed, knowing that my judgment about what was truly fixed or changeable was necessarily limited. The universal city has room for every kind of person, every kind of experience, every kind of challenge. Your particular role, emperor or farmer, general or merchant, parent or child, is your contribution to the whole. Excellence in that role, regardless of how humble or exalted it might seem, serves the cosmic good. Understanding this dissolves the ego's desperate need to be special, important, or recognized. You matter not because you're unique, but because you're part of something infinitely larger than yourself. Your significance comes not from standing apart, but from playing your part with skill and dedication. When you live as a conscious citizen of the universal city, every action becomes service, every challenge becomes practice, and every moment becomes an opportunity to contribute to the greater good. Asterisk, asterisk, the greatest teacher I ever had wore no robes, held no position, and spoke no words. Death itself became my most valuable instructor, though the lessons were often brutal and always unwelcome. When you rule an empire during plague and war, death becomes your daily companion, forcing you to confront the one certainty that most people spend their lives avoiding. I kept a funeral mask in my private chambers, not from morbid fascination, but as a daily reminder of what awaits us all. Each morning, I would look at it and remember, this day could be my last. What does that knowledge demand of me? This practice, which the Stoics call memento mori, transformed how I approached every decision, every relationship, every moment. Most people fear death because they see it as the end of everything meaningful. But contemplating mortality daily taught me the opposite. Death gives life its urgency and preciousness. When you truly accept that your time is limited, you stop wasting it on trivial pursuits. Petty grievances dissolve. Meaningless status games lose their appeal. Only what truly matters remains. During the worst plague years, I watched thousands die, including some of my closest advisors and friends. Each death was a lesson in the temporary nature of all earthly attachments. The senator who seemed so important yesterday was gone today. The general who appeared indispensable was replaced tomorrow. Yet the empire continued. The work went on. Life adapted and flowed around these losses like water around stones. This wasn't callousness, it was clarity. Understanding death's inevitability freed me from the paralyzing fear of loss that prevents so many from fully engaging with life. When you know that everything you love will eventually be taken away, you can love more deeply in the present, without clinging desperately to permanence. The practice also revealed death's democratic nature. Plague killed rich and poor, noble and common, young and old, with equal indifference. Standing in the imperial cemetery, surrounded by the graves of emperors and slaves alike, I understood that death recognizes no earthly distinctions. This humbled my ego and deepened my compassion. We are all temporary visitors in this world, regardless of our current circumstances. Contemplating death also clarified what kind of legacy truly matters. Material possessions return to dust. Political achievements fade from memory. Even the mightiest empires eventually crumble. But the wisdom you embody, the kindness you show, the principles you live by, these ripple forward through the people you touch, creating effects that outlast any monument. I began asking myself each evening, if I died tonight, what would my life have meant? What kind of person would I have been? This wasn't self-torture, but practical evaluation. If the answer wasn't satisfactory, I had tomorrow to improve it, but only if I didn't waste tomorrow, assuming I had infinite tomorrows. Death also taught me the absurdity of most human drama. When you regularly contemplate the fact that everyone you know, including yourself, will be gone within a few decades, current conflicts shrank to their proper size. That senator who insulted me, in 50 years, will both be dust, and the insult will matter to no one. That general who challenged my authority, time will resolve our disagreement more thoroughly than any argument. This perspective wasn't escapism, was liberation. Freed from the fear of death, I could live more fully. Freed from attachment to permanence, I could appreciate the temporary beauty around me. Freed from the illusion that earthly status matters ultimately, I could focus on what actually does, becoming the best possible version of myself, while I have the chance. Asterisk, asterisk. The most important hour of my day happened before anyone else was awake. While the palace slept and the empire rested, I would light my oil lamp and prepare my mind for whatever challenges awaited. This morning practice became the foundation of everything else, the daily fortress building that made all other accomplishments possible. I would begin by acknowledging reality. Today I will meet interference, ingratitude, insolence, disloyalty, ill will, and selfishness. This wasn't pessimism, it was preparation. By accepting that difficulties were inevitable, I eliminated the energy waste of surprise and disappointment when they appeared. Then I would remind myself of what I could and couldn't control. I can control my responses, my choices, my effort, and my character. I cannot control other people's actions, the weather, the outcomes of battles, or the length of my life. This simple distinction saved me countless hours of frustration and worry. Next came the most crucial element, setting my intention for virtue. Today, I will seek to act with wisdom in my decisions, justice in my judgments, courage in my challenges, and self-discipline in my desires. These four cardinal virtues became my daily compass, guiding every interaction and choice. I would also contemplate the temporary nature of everything around me. This empire, this body, this very moment are temporary arrangements of atoms that will return to their original elements. Nothing lasts forever, including my problems. This meditation brought immediate perspective to whatever crisis seemed overwhelming the night before. The practice included what I called premeditation of adversity, mentally rehearsing how I would respond to likely challenges. If the Senate opposed my policies, how would I respond with wisdom rather than anger? If military reports brought bad news, how would I maintain composure? If personal attacks came, how would I separate my ego from my duty? This wasn't worry or anxiety, it was practical preparation. Athletes visualize successful performance. I visualized virtuous response to difficulty by rehearsing wisdom in advance. I made wise action more automatic when pressure mounted. I would also reflect on my role in the larger cosmic order. I am one small part of an infinite universe, with a brief time to contribute to the common good. My personal preferences matter less than my duty to serve the whole. This reminder dissolved self-pity and self-importance, replacing them with purposeful focus. The morning practice concluded with gratitude. I would identify specific things to appreciate, the health to serve another day, advisors who offered honest counsel, the empire's basic stability, even the challenges that would help me grow stronger. Gratitude shifted my default perspective, from scarcity to abundance, from complaint to appreciation. This routine took perhaps 30 minutes, but it shaped the remaining 16 hours. Prepared by morning reflection, I could face senatorial opposition with equanimity, military crises with clarity, and personal disappointments with resilience. The small investment of pre-dawn preparation paid enormous dividends in daily effectiveness. Most importantly, the practice built cumulative strength. Each morning of preparation made the next day's challenges slightly more manageable. Like physical training, consistency mattered more than intensity. A brief daily practice, sustained over years, created unshakable mental discipline. The lamp burned low, dawn approached, and duty called. But armed with clear intention, realistic expectations, and grateful perspective, I was ready to serve the empire and embody the principles that gave my life meaning. The day's storms might rage, but my inner citadel stood prepared. Asterisk, asterisk, if morning preparation was the foundation of my day, evening reflection was its crown. As shadows lengthened and the palace grew quiet, I would return to my private chambers with my night journal, ready to extract wisdom from whatever the day had delivered, triumph or disaster, progress or setback. The practice began with honest self-examination. I would review each significant interaction and decision, asking not did I succeed, but did I act according to my principles. Success and failure were often beyond my control, but virtue was always within my choice. When the Germanic chieftain insulted me during negotiations, did I respond with wisdom or wounded pride? If I had reacted from ego, I would note it without harsh self-judgments, simply as information for tomorrow's improvement. If I had maintained composure, I would acknowledge what had enabled that success. I would also examine my thoughts and emotions throughout the day. When news came of the grain shortage in Alexandria, what was my initial reaction? Did I respond from fear or from rational assessment? This practice revealed patterns in my thinking that helped or hindered clear judgment. Particularly valuable was reviewing moments when I had been disturbed or upset. Why did the senator's opposition anger me? What expectation or attachment was I clinging to? Usually, I discovered that my suffering came not from external events, but from my resistance to those events. The evening review also included celebrating progress, however small. Today I listened more and spoke less during the provincial governor's meeting. I maintained patience when Commodus disappointed me again. I found genuine appreciation for a critic's valid points. Acknowledging growth reinforced positive patterns. Central to the practice was extracting lessons for future application. What did today teach me about leadership under pressure? How can I better prepare for similar challenges? What would I do differently if I faced the same situation again? This transformed daily experiences into accumulated wisdom, but perhaps the most powerful element was deliberate gratitude. I would list specific things that had enriched the day: the advisor who offered honest feedback, the soldier who showed courage despite fear, the simple pleasure of a well-prepared meal after a difficult day of decisions. This wasn't naive optimism of him. The day had brought genuine hardships, but I learned that gratitude is not about pretending difficulties don't exist. It's about recognizing the good that coexists with the challenging. Even terrible days contained elements worth appreciating. The practice concluded with releasing the day completely. What is done is done. What happened has already happened. I have extracted what wisdom I can, and now I release both successes and failures. Tomorrow requires a fresh mind, not one burdened by yesterday's concerns. This release was crucial for restorative sleep and clear morning thinking. Carrying the day's emotional residue into tomorrow only clouded judgment and wasted energy on unchangeable past events. The evening review transformed daily experiences from random occurrences into deliberate education. Each day became a teacher, each challenge a lesson, each interaction an opportunity for growth. Nothing was wasted when everything could become wisdom. Nothing tested my philosophical principles more than the daily necessity of working with people who seemed determined to make life difficult. Corrupt senators, ambitious generals, scheming courtiers, and bureaucrats more interested in personal advancement than public service. The Senate ring I wore daily reminded me that leadership means finding ways to work effectively with people you would never choose as friends. My first instinct was always to fight or eliminate opposition. When senators undermined my policies, I wanted to punish them. When generals questioned my military decisions, I felt my authority threatened. When courtiers spread malicious gossip, I burned with indignation. But I learned that reacting emotionally to difficult people only multiplied the difficulty. The breakthrough came when I stopped taking their behavior personally. That corrupt senator wasn't targeting me specifically, was simply his nature, and I happened to be in his environment. The scheming courtier wasn't plotting against Marcus Aurelius, the person she was maneuvering around whoever held power. Understanding this removed the emotional charge from their actions. I developed what I call the scorpion principle. If a scorpion stings you, you don't take it personally. Stinging is simply what scorpions do. You protect yourself appropriately, but you don't waste energy on anger or moral indignation. Some people lie because lying is their nature. Some manipulate because manipulation is their habit. Some betray because loyalty is foreign to them. This doesn't mean becoming naive or failing to protect yourself and the empire. It means responding strategically rather than emotionally. When you understand someone's nature clearly, you can work around their limitations and even use their predictable behavior to achieve good outcomes. For instance, Senator Cassius was notorious for opposing any policy that didn't personally benefit him. Rather than fighting this nature, I learned to structure proposals so that supporting them served his interests. His selfishness became a tool for achieving policy goals that served the common good. General Ovidius was ambitious to a fault and constantly sought opportunities to increase his own glory. Rather than seeing this as a threat, I channeled his ambition toward challenging military objectives that served the empire. His vanity became a resource for Rome's defense. I also learned to look for the hidden virtues in difficult people. The senator, who seemed obstructionist, often raised valid concerns I had overlooked. The general, who challenged my authority, sometimes possessed crucial battlefield knowledge. The courtier, who spread gossip, often revealed information I needed to know. Most importantly, I recognized that difficult people were some of my best teachers. Patient senators never tested my self-control, dealing with hostile ones did. Loyal generals never challenged me to explain my reasoning, clearly argumentative ones forced me to think more rigorously. Every difficult person became practice for the 4 cardinal virtues. Corrupt officials required wisdom to outmaneuver. Unjust critics demanded that I embody justice more clearly. Aggressive enemies called for courage. Manipulative allies tested my self-discipline. The goal wasn't to change difficult people, that was beyond my control and usually impossible. Anyway, the goal was to work skillfully with human nature as it actually exists, not as I wished it were. This approach reduced my stress enormously while increasing my effectiveness as a leader. In my tent during the Germanic campaigns, I kept a bent sword, a weapon that had survived brutal combat, not through rigid strength, but through the ability to bend without breaking. That sword taught me more about resilience than any philosophical treatise ever could. True strength isn't the ability to resist all pressure. It's the ability to absorb impact and return to your essential form. Resilience isn't about becoming hard or emotionless. Early in my reign, I tried to make myself invulnerable by suppressing all feeling, by becoming like stone against life's blows. This approach failed miserably. Stone may resist pressure for a while, but when it finally breaks, it shatters completely. The bent sword showed me a better way: flexibility that preserves integrity. The plague years became my greatest teacher. In this virtue, wave after wave of crisis crashed over the empire. Disease, military pressure, political opposition, economic strain, social unrest. Each challenge would have been manageable alone, but they came in relentless succession, testing not just my strength, but my capacity to recover from each blow before the next one landed. I learned that resilience has 3 essential components: preparation, adaptation, and recovery. Preparation meant building reserves of wisdom, health, and perspective during calm periods. Adaptation meant adjusting tactics and expectations when circumstances changed. Recovery meant extracting lessons from setbacks while releasing their emotional weight. Physical resilience came through maintaining my health despite the demands of leadership. I ate simply, exercised regularly, and protected my sleep even during crises. Leaders who neglect their bodies inevitably find their minds less capable of handling pressure. The emperor's duty to his people includes the duty to remain strong enough to serve them effectively. Mental resilience required daily practice of the principles I've shared: morning preparation, clear perception, disciplined desire, right action, evening reflection. These weren't abstract exercises, but practical tools for maintaining equilibrium when everything around me was chaos. Like a muscle, mental resilience grew stronger through consistent use. Emotional resilience meant learning to feel deeply without being overwhelmed by feeling. When loyal friends died in the plague, I grieved fully, but I didn't let grief paralyze my ability to continue serving those who remained alive. When Commodus disappointed me, I felt the pain completely, but I didn't let that pain poison my relationships with others. The key insight was understanding that resilience isn't about avoiding suffering, it's about suffering skillfully. Pain is inevitable. Suffering is optional. Pain is what happens to you. Suffering is how you interpret and respond to what happens to you. You can experience loss without being lost, face defeat without being defeated, endure criticism without being diminished. I also discovered that resilience is partly about knowing when to yield. The bent sword survived because it knew when to give ground. Sometimes wisdom means strategic retreat. Sometimes strength means admitting mistakes. Sometimes victory means accepting temporary defeat to preserve long-term effectiveness. Most importantly, resilience became a gift I could offer others. When I remained steady during crisis, it gave my advisors permission to think clearly rather than panic. When I recovered quickly from setbacks, it showed my soldiers that defeat wasn't permanent. When I maintained hope during the darkest periods, it reminded the empire that this too would pass. The bent sword never became straight again, but it remained functional, reliable, and strong. That's the nature of true resilience, not the recovery of innocence, but the development of wisdom-based strength that can handle whatever comes next. In the final years of my reign, I commissioned a statue to commemorate our victories on the Germanic frontier. The sculptor worked for months, creating what promised to be a magnificent monument to Roman perseverance. Then, when it was nearly complete, I ordered work stopped, and the unfinished statue left as it was. This decision puzzled many, but it taught me the most liberating lesson of my life. I had spent years worrying about my legacy, how history would remember my reign, whether my philosophical writings would survive, what kind of empire I would leave to my successor. This concern had become a subtle form of slavery, making me calculate every decision partly based on how it would appear to future generations, rather than simply doing what was right in the present moment. The unfinished statue became my teacher about the futility of trying to control posthumous reputation. Even the most carefully planned monuments crumble. Even the most detailed historical records are lost or misinterpreted. Even the most virtuous lives are eventually forgotten by all. But scholars, why exhaust myself trying to shape something that was ultimately beyond my influence? This realization brought tremendous freedom. When you stop trying to control how you'll be remembered, you can focus entirely on how you're living right now. When you release attachment to posthumous fame, you can make decisions based purely on present virtue rather than future reputation. I began asking different questions. Instead of how will this look to historians, I asked, what does wisdom require in this situation? Instead of will people remember me as a great emperor, I asked, am I serving the common good today? Instead of what legacy am I creating, I asked, what kind of person am I being in this moment? The shift was profound. Policies I had avoided because they might be unpopular became possible when I stopped worrying about popularity. Difficult but necessary decisions became easier when I wasn't calculating their effect on my historical image. Leadership became more authentic when I wasn't performing for an imaginary audience of future judges. I also realized that the best legacy isn't what people say about you, it's how your example influences their character. If my commitment to virtue inspired even one senator to act more justly, that was worth more than a dozen statues. If my philosophical practices helped even one citizen find peace during suffering, that mattered more than any historical monument. The unfinished statue stood in the palace courtyard, a daily reminder that completion isn't the goal, faithful effort is. You don't control whether your work gets finished, whether your plans succeed, or whether anyone remembers your contributions. You only control whether you bring your best effort to each day's duties. This perspective eliminated the anxiety that had shadowed my later years. Death could come tomorrow. Commodus might destroy everything I had built. Barbarians might overrun the empire, and my philosophical writings might be lost forever. None of that mattered as much as I had thought. What mattered was living today according to my principles, regardless of what tomorrow might bring. Letting go of legacy concerns didn't make me careless, it made me more focused on what actually mattered. Being useful to the present moment rather than impressive to future ages. My final military campaign began when I was already feeling the weight of my 58 years. The Germanic tribes had broken their treaties again, and duty demanded that I return to the frontier one last time. I knew this campaign would likely be my last. My body was failing, my energy was diminished, and death felt closer with each passing day. But this knowledge transformed the experience completely. Instead of dreading the hardships ahead, I approached them with curious detachment. How would the principles I had developed over decades of practice perform under the ultimate test? Would my philosophy proved adequate when everything I cared about was at stake? The campaign was brutal. Winter set in early and viciously. Supply lines stretched thin. The enemy proved more resourceful than expected. Several times our position seemed hopeless. Yet I found myself calmer than I had been during much easier challenges in my youth. The proximity of death had paradoxically freed me from the fear of living badly. I carried my philosophical writings with me, blood-stained from handling them with unwashed hands after battle reports. These weren't pristine academic exercises anymore, they were survival tools, battle-tested wisdom for navigating the chaos of war and the approach of mortality. Every principle had been refined by fire. The discipline of perception served me when scouts reported apparently catastrophic enemy movements. Instead of panicking, I saw clearly information that required analysis and response, nothing more. The discipline of desire helped when harsh weather threatened our campaign timeline. I could prefer better conditions while working skillfully with whatever nature provided. The discipline of action guided me through countless decisions where delay meant defeat, but haste meant disaster. I acted from rational assessment rather than fear or hope, accepting that even wise decisions might lead to poor outcomes if circumstances were beyond my control. Most powerfully, my acceptance of mortality freed me to take necessary risks that a life-clinging commander might have avoided. When personal safety conflicted with tactical necessity, the choice was clear. An emperor approaching death naturally could afford to be bold in ways that an emperor, desperate to preserve his life, could not. The soldiers noticed this change in me. Veterans remarked that I seemed more present, more decisive, more genuinely concerned with their welfare than with my own safety. This authenticity earned their loyalty in ways that imperial authority alone never could. They followed me not because they had to, but because they trusted that I would never ask them to face dangers I wouldn't face myself. During quiet moments between battles, I would write by firelight, recording not grand philosophical insights, but practical observations about how wisdom works under extreme pressure. These notes became some of my most valuable teachings, not because they were profound, but because they were proven. The campaign succeeded, but that almost seemed secondary. The real victory was discovering that everything I had learned about inner mastery remained valid even when outer circumstances were at their worst. The fortress of the mind held firm, even when the body was failing and the empire was threatened. Philosophy wasn't academic theory. It was practical preparation for exactly this kind of ultimate test. Asterisk, asterisk, as I write these final words. Death approaches with the quiet certainty of dawn. The fever that began during the Germanic campaign has returned, stronger now, and my physicians exchange the meaningful glances of men who know their limitations. But I feel no fear, no desperate clinging to life, no rage against the dying of the light. Everything I have learned has prepared me for this moment. Lying here in my tent, listening to the sounds of an empire that will continue without me, I understand that death is not the opposite of life, fits the completion of it. Every breath I've taken, every decision I've made, every moment of joy and suffering has been leading to this natural conclusion. To rage against death would be like raging against birth. Both are simply parts of the same magnificent process. The final scroll I leave behind contains not grand pronouncements, but simple truths. Character matters more than reputation. Virtue is its own reward. The present moment is the only one you actually possess. What you cannot control cannot hurt you unless you let it. Love others not for what they give you, but for what they are. My greatest regret is not any specific mistake, but the time I wasted fighting against reality instead of working with it. Years lost to anger over things I couldn't change. Energy squandered on worry about outcomes beyond my control. Moments missed because I was dwelling on past failures or future fears instead of being present to what was actually happening. But even these regrets serve wisdom's purpose. They teach what matters most when time runs short. If you remember nothing else from my story, remember this: life is brief and uncertain, so use it to become the person you're capable of being. Don't wait for perfect circumstances to begin living according to your highest principles. Don't postpone virtue until you feel ready for it. Start now with whatever challenges you're facing. In whatever circumstances you find yourself, the empire will survive my death as it survived my life. Other emperors will face similar challenges and make different choices. Some will succeed where I failed. Others will fail where I succeeded. This is the natural order. Each generation faces its tests with the wisdom it has developed, learning lessons that prepare them for challenges we cannot imagine. What I hope survives is not my specific solutions to particular problems, but the approach I've tried to embody. Face difficulty with reason rather than emotion. Respond to setbacks with resilience rather than despair. Treat others with compassion rather than judgment. And remember always that your character is the one thing no external force can touch without your permission. To those who will face pressures that feel unbearable, remember that you are stronger than you know. To those who feel overwhelmed by responsibilities beyond their control, remember that you can only be responsible for your response. To those who struggle with difficult people and impossible circumstances, remember that these are not obstacles to virtue, they are opportunities to practice it. The lamp burns low now, as does my strength, but I am grateful for the privilege of serving the empire, for the challenges that strengthened my character, for the philosophy that guided my choices, and for the opportunity to share what I've learned with others who must walk their own paths toward wisdom. Death comes to all, but it need not come to those who are unprepared. Live so that when your final moment arrives, you can meet it with the calm satisfaction of knowing you used your time well. This is the ultimate victory, not over enemies or circumstances, but over the part of yourself that would waste the precious gift of existence. The sun sets on my reign, but it rises on yours. Make it count.